But I'd like to know, where did your passion come from, and how come your passion is still alive, 20 plus years later?
I mean, I was born in the 1960s in the UK. Anybody here born in the 60s? Yeah, got a few people, yeah. It was grim back then. It was grim if you were a black child. It was still, the UK was still really struggling with what multiculturalism meant. We were the first black family to move into the road that I grew up on. And people were not kind. And I remember stories of my mother washing excrement off the front door. First time I heard the M-word was when it was called to me by another child who was 5 years old. So it was very difficult. I very quickly appreciated what my skin colour meant. And at the same time, I don't know if it still happens now, and I'd hate to think it does, but teachers back then were perfectly comfortable with limiting black children's aspirations. I was regularly told, Pamela, don't worry too much about education. It's not for you. It's not for me. I even had one teacher tell me that I should do a job in service of others. I'm not quite sure what she meant by that, but actually, as it turns out, I am in service of others. But anyway. And so I kind of grew up with that. So I've got that narrative at school. And then at home, my parents are saying, you can be whatever you want to be. Get a great education. But you can be whatever you want to be. We didn't come to the UK for you not to be better than what we were. And I think this kind of sense of wanting to make my parents proud for the things that they had to endure in order so that I could progress. My parents are now dead, and that saddens me a lot in so many ways because they didn't necessarily see what I achieved. But they were, they came to this country and they were just forging a life alongside other black people to make the world a better place for us. And we have to honour that. All of us have to honour that. I have to honour that. And also because I now have 2 black boys of my own. And so I could never live with myself if I did not create a better legacy for them. So that's what inspires me.
And I guess, what has been the hardest part about being in this field? Have you seen much change, or what's your analysis over the last few years?
Gosh, it's really interesting. I was thinking about this the other day because somebody asked me a similar question. When I first came into this work, it was hard, right? In fact, when I was working at Bechtel doing diversity and inclusion, I remember picking up the phone and calling other engineering HR departments and saying, I'm about to start a D&I office at Bechtel. Would you be interested in, sharing ideas and best practices and let's form a little bit of a group? And most people put the phone down on me, and those that didn't said to me, why are you even bothering with that? One person even said, there are too many ethnic minorities in this country already, because they didn't know who they were speaking to on the other end of the phone. So I had all sorts of weird and wonderful responses to that. And that was way back then. And in fact, I laugh because I don't even know, is there still page 3 in the Sun? No? Well, for those of you who don't know, page 3 used to be... Does everybody know what page 3 was? Okay, I don't need to explain. So back then, the page 3 girls were stuck on the walls. And that was okay. Nobody said it was wrong. It's hard to imagine. And smoking was still in the office and all those kind of weird and wonderful things. And so doing D&I then was really tough. I mean, really tough, because generally the masses, and particularly at that time it was men, and predominantly white men, were just not interested because they saw it as displacing them. So it was tough, but you just have to be resilient and keep going. Over the years, obviously, that's changed. Momentum with D&I has meant that organisations have embraced D&I for one reason or another. I remember sort of watching it, sort of the narrative change. So it was very much about legislation and compliance when I started. You did it because the law told you to. And then we sort of moved into this decade, which was about the business case for D&I. And then there was all this research that showed that actually those companies that were engaged in D&I and had D&I in their leadership were more successful than those that didn't. And so companies started to come on board with the business case for diversity and inclusion. And then we kind of got to this place of companies doing it because actually it's the right thing to do. And there's been everything in between. I think it's really interesting kind of where we are now. I don't know how many of you read this, but I think it was last week. 200 CEOs in the US corporations stood up and said that actually businesses were no longer about creating profit for the shareholder, which oh my God, I couldn't believe that. And it was about doing something that was going to change the world, that was going to help move communities, that was going to support diversity and inclusion. And I honestly never thought in my entire life doing this work that I would hear CEOs commit to doing that and recognizing there was a greater purpose than just creating profit. So I do feel that we're kind of moving into a very different space around diversity and inclusion than we've ever been in. And at the same time, we've got against this backdrop of the rise of the far right. And then, of course, political correctness has gone way out the window now, both with us voting for Brexit and the narrative that went on around that and immigration. And then Donald Trump, he'll just talk about anything, won't he? So, the whole narrative around political correctness has changed. And there's this weird kind of thing going on between this kind of mass sort of social movement, and that's happening outside of business as well as inside of business. #MeToo, #Black Lives Matter, hashtags Yes All Women. I mean, there are so many of them. There's this massive sort of social movement against the backdrop of the far right. So, very interesting times. And then, again, the other thing that's quite interesting to me is I'm kind of sitting there being a part of it, but also watching it, which is we started on compliance around diversity and inclusion, and we're kind of going back to compliance. We've had the gender pay gap. We're about to have the ethnicity pay gap. And we've got various charters that are springing up across industry. So I kind of think we're in this place where people are just saying, it's taking too long. We need to force the agenda much quicker. But you know what? I'm, if anything, eternally optimistic about change. I'm optimistic because every year I see more and more black people rising. I see I don't know how many of you see the Power List every year that when it comes out. Every year you see new faces in there. There are more of us rising, and I feel really optimistic about the future. It just might take a little bit of time.
Okay, let's clap.
You don't need to.
Don't worry, every time you speak, it's worth a clap, don't worry. So it's quite interesting you say that because obviously this room is filled with a lot of black professionals that want to get ahead in their career. And we do know of the barriers that exist and obstacles that exist. But my question to you is, I guess, how do we make your job easier? What can we do to be better equipped so that, when the right opportunity comes, we're there? When you're implementing new solutions, we're the ones receiving it. What can we do?
Yeah. Well, I gave you the first tip, which is put your hands up. I think, sometimes, this isn't just to black people in the room, but I think sometimes we can just get our heads down, get on with the job, and hope that somebody's going to tap us on the shoulder and say, here you go, this wonderful job for you. The reality is, and I'm sure most of you already know this, that's not the way the world works. It's about networks. It's about who you know. It's about who knows you. It's about who knows what you do. And so, first, put your hand up. Be visible. I say this to people all the time. I can't tell you how many times I've been into meetings and I've had other black people in the room with me who've said nothing during the meeting because they don't want to say something silly or, not contribute in a way that's meaningful. And I always say, never leave a room without having said something, because if you don't say something, you might as well be invisible. No one will remember you when you've walked out that room. Nobody. So always have something to say, Make sure it's sensible, but have something to say. Also, I would say, and I was saying this to the young lady sat in the front there, surround yourself with people who have paved the way ahead of you, because they will give you lots of tips, ideas, and suggestions. They will introduce you to their networks. Networks are really important. A lot of people say to me, who's in your network? Well, you know what? I didn't have a network when I started. There wasn't anybody. So I had to make my own network. And I will say the same to you. If you're waiting for a network to come to you, it may never come. Create your own network. Reach out to others. There's so many wonderful people in this room. Just make sure that you make connections. Make connections. Help each other. Support one another. Again, I sometimes feel that we wait for it to happen to us. That might not be the same of other demographic groups. They're out there. So we have to be out there too. And also, don't be frightened to connect with people outside of our demographic group. I'm not. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. You know, we learn from each other and from having different perspectives and ideas. So build your network, really important. The other thing is, I would suggest, is making sure people know what you do. Throughout my career, I haven't always had great bosses. Sometimes I've had really good ones, but mostly I've not had great bosses. And if you're relying on your boss to help you get ahead and you don't have a great boss, that won't happen. So I had to learn to make myself visible to people above my boss, because I knew that my boss wasn't going to do it for me. The challenge I had, of course, was how do I do that in a way that makes me feel comfortable? Because I don't like bragging, and I know a lot of people do that, but I don't personally like doing that. So I had to figure out a way of being able to make sure other people knew what I did in a way that seemed, you know, like I wasn't showing off. So I would spend lots of time looking for ways in which I could sort of raise my visibility. Many times I would do things like, you know, sort of hang around in sort of common areas, waiting for my boss's boss to turn up. And then I would sort of accidentally bump into them. Or jump into the lift when I see them getting into the lift and say, hi, I'm Pamela, I work for blah, blah. But I wouldn't sort of just blurt out what I'm doing or showing off about what I'm doing. I'd say, oh, it's really interesting, that project that we're involved in. I'm doing this tiny piece of it. And do you know what I found? So I would do it in a way that kind of was talking about business, but kind of dropped in what I was doing as a part of what was important for my boss. And that was the way that I kind of got visibility to other leaders. And then they would say, oh, I didn't even know you did that. Come and tell me about it. Or I'd say, can I come and spend some time with you and tell you about what I'm doing? And again, that was a great way of sort of making those introductions. I feel much more comfortable doing that, and I still do that even to today. Even sort of the seniority that I have, I still feel uncomfortable sending emails saying what I'm doing, so I continue to do that. So find ways of navigating around the organisation and navigating around some of the blocks in your organisation. Having great advocates. Don't be scared to just go up to someone and say, I really admire you, I like the way that you do X, and I'd love for you to be my mentor. Sometimes the word mentor scares people. I say that because it scares me sometimes, because I must be mentoring at least 30 or 40 people right now. And so if someone says, can you be my mentor, it feels like just another job to do. Another way of doing it is to say, I really admire the way that you, present. I'd love to know more about that. Can you share some tips with me? And that way, you get the information you need without making them feel like you're asking for a long-term commitment to them. Have as many mentors as you possibly can. I've got loads of people that I go to for ideas, to just help shape my perspective. So, you know, there are lots of bits and pieces in there, but I think the overriding message that I'd like to leave with you is you are responsible for your own destiny. Nobody else is. And so if you want to progress, you have to go and make that happen. Stuff like that.
So as Global Head of Diversity and Inclusion at Bloomberg, what does a day in the life of Pamela Hutchinson look like?
There is no 2 days that look the same. Gosh, let me pick a day for you, any day. I do a whole load of different things. So sometimes I'm coaching leaders on diversity and inclusion. Sometimes they have an issue that they want to sort of chew over with me. Sometimes it's just that they're wanting to develop a strategy and they don't know where to start. Occasionally, leaders come to me because they feel that they have dealt with a particular situation not particularly well, and they want coaching on how to do it better. I also spend a lot of time talking to the clients, our clients, Bloomberg's clients, and very often I speak to CEOs who, again, are asking for guidance around often the gender agenda, but more increasingly around ethnicity, and they're wanting me to help them kind of think it through. I could be speaking on a panel like I am here. I could be working with one of our many communities. We have, we call them communities at Bloomberg for everybody else, employee networks. I could be working one of our employee networks, helping them to strategize or involved in some sort of event or activity that they're doing. I spend a lot of time introducing clients to Bloomberg, interestingly enough. One of the things about diversity is that you're out and about all the time and you're meeting people all the time. As Bloomberg, we're obviously wanting to make connections with people in the financial industry. That means sometimes ringing them up and trying to make appointments. Sometimes that's not always easy. But because I get out and about so much, I meet loads of people, so I'm able to make connections between clients that we want to know and Bloomberg. So the sales team are often working with my team because they're very keen to make introductions to get new business, and diversity and inclusion has been a really important part of that. Gosh, there are so many things. I spend a lot of time traveling back and forth across the Atlantic. I'm in New York twice a month, and I spend time with the team over in the US. A large part of my job involves working with our management committee, so that's Michael Bloomberg and a number of the executives. And again, I coach them, I give them guidance. They look at me as the eyes and ears, what's going on in the organisation, to help them think about how they want to integrate D&I into our business as usual. Gosh, there are so many things I can't even begin to tell you, actually.
No, that sounds a lot. I love the fact everyone claps like after each one.
You don't have to clap after each one, it's fine.
So just talking more on you being a black woman in a senior position, you know, a lot of us aspire to those kind of levels. How's it been for you navigating those spaces, and has, you know, race ever played a part in your journey, or, you know, what advice can you give to everybody here about getting to the top in their career?
Do you know what? It's really funny. Someone else asked me that question recently, and I had to really think about it because, honestly and truthfully, I'm not sure how often race actually impacted my career. I'm sure it did behind the scenes, perhaps, but not visibly to me. And I'll tell you why I'm not so aware of it. When I was growing up, my parents said to me, "You have to be the best." Now, there was a different spin on that, because I know that we've all heard something like that. My parents said you have to be better than everybody. It wasn't just better than your white colleagues, it was better than everybody. And they never talked about race in that way. And so that was just something that was in my head. I have to be the best that I possibly can, and preferably better than everybody. And so that kind of mindset was just in my head all the way through my career. And for me, every block was just something I had to leap over. I never saw it as a block and then that's it, I give up. It was always something to go over. And I would find every possible way of getting what I needed. Sometimes the journey isn't straight. In fact, it isn't straight for most people. And so I spent most of my time doing my career like this, going round people, going up, going down, going sideways. I had a very clear goal in mind. And if you have that goal in mind, then you just have to do whatever you need to do to get to it, preferably without hurting anybody, and with bringing people along with you. I've never done a job where I haven't brought people along with me. I don't think there's been people in my team, any of my teams, that haven't gone on to do bigger and better jobs than me. It's about making sure that as I progress, I'm reaching down and pulling someone with me. And when you do that, you know, the universe really does help you. Things open up for you. So, you know, as I've gone through my career, I haven't been aware of race being an issue because I didn't make it an issue for myself. And where I thought it could have been an issue, well, I went out of my way to prove people wrong. It's interesting because when I came into diversity and inclusion, one of the reasons that I almost didn't do this full time, right back, so when I got the job at Bechtel, I was doing 2 roles. I was still a legal advisor and I was doing diversity and inclusion. And when I went across to Goldman's, they wanted me to just do D&I. And I almost never took the role. And I almost never took the role because to me, I'd be fitting a stereotype. Black woman doing D&I. And I never wanted to fit a stereotype. It's laughable now when I think about it because I don't see many black women being global head of diversity and inclusion. Well, not in the UK anyway. So it's funny that I thought that I'd fit a stereotype doing it. But I've always wanted to just keep pushing forward. If someone said you can't do it, I proved to them I could do it. I'm trying to think, honestly, I was thinking about this the other day. I've had more sexist comments than I've ever heard racist comments. I remember many years ago when I was asking for a pay increase because I thought I deserved it, and one of my managers saying to me, "Your husband earns good money, why do you need a pay increase?" That wasn't that long ago either. Actually, there was one time, I remember, this was a long time ago, 20 maybe years ago. I was sat in an office and my colleague who was sat opposite me was sort of looking at me like this for quite some time. And I said, is this a problem? And he said, "Do you have any white people in your family?" And I said, "Why do you ask?" And he said, "Well, because you're articulate and well-spoken and you're educated." And I said, actually, I do have white people in my family, and they're the ones that are literate. But that's, and he had no impact over my job or my career or anything, so it didn't really matter. He was just an idiot. But I can't recall a time when I felt like I've been held back because of this colour of my skin. Now, I'm not saying that never happens, because of course it does. But I never think about that. All I'm thinking about is, how can I have your job, and how can I be better than you, and how can I, show everyone what I'm capable of? And that's all I think about. I don't really think about too much about being in competition with people, because I've got very clear in my head where my goal is. And I will just find every possible way of being able to get to where I need to get to. And that's through leveraging my network, that's through helping others, that's through surrounding myself with people who are going to be supporters of me and not people who bring me down. I've had those people in my life as well. And that's making sure that I leverage every advocate that is available to me. And most of them have been white men.
Amazing. A round of applause.
No, please don't.
Oh, no, not for that. No, not for that. I mean, just everything you said. But we're going to open it. We're going to open it now for Q&A. So I know people have questions. So if you do have a question, put your hand up. A microphone will come to you. Please say your name and what you do as well. So here's a question over there in the middle. Microphone. So it's coming up now.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you.
Stand up.
My name's Nathan. I'm actually in diversity and inclusion as well, so I'm diversity and inclusion coordinator at Soho House. My question was just around, some of my experiences have been that there's a lot of money and effort that organizations are putting into, 1, LGBT equality, and 2, gender equality. Why do you think there's such a barrier when it comes to race in the workplace?
Thank you.
it's a really sensitive topic. I talk about this all the time. If you ever hear me speak, if you look at me on YouTube, I'm mostly speaking about race. And I feel I have to, I'm a black woman. But it's a sensitive topic and people feel uncomfortable. I was in a room full of diversity practitioners about a year ago, and I would say 95% of the room were white women. And we were talking about race, and to be honest, I really wanted to be somewhere else that evening. So I thought, if I'm going to go, this better be worth my while. So I turned up, and the conversation started, and it was tiptoeing around the conversation, and nobody really just called it out for what it was. And it was the same conversation I'd heard 20 years ago, like we hadn't progressed. And so I kind of put my hand up, because I'm usually the one that's disruptive. And I said, seriously, is that what we're like? I was supposed to be somewhere else. If we're not going to have a real conversation about race, then we might as well all go. And I said, look, what are the real issues here? And then I asked a question which was probably a bit controversial, but I said, the vast majority of us in the room are white. How comfortable do we as diversity practitioners leading on race feel in our own company? How comfortable are we talking about it in our own companies? And none of them put their hands up. And I said, well, if we as diversity practitioners are not comfortable to talk about race, we don't stand a chance of being able to push our organisations to move this agenda forward. And so we, as D&I practitioners, need to feel comfortable. Ethnicity is tied up in so many things. It's sensitive. The language alone is tough. I've had people call me black, coloured, all sorts of permeations of that. Usually I just say, that's not an appropriate term anymore, or I prefer to be called black, or whatever it is. But people are so uncomfortable even using the language that it stops conversations even being had in organisations. And the other piece, again, that I think is that we as a community have a responsibility to help drive it as well. And very often, and I've done this myself in organisations where I've gone in and developed programmes for ethnic minorities, and which group do you think it is that criticises me the most for doing that? Right. We have a responsibility to drive this agenda as much as we expect our white colleagues to drive the agenda. And so we have to put our hands up and take responsibility for moving it forward. So, it starts with a conversation, an uncomfortable conversation, but it really does. One of the things that we do at Bloomberg, and this is where I wanted to start this uncomfortable conversation, we call them inclusion dialogues. And what we do is we bring people together around topics that are difficult to talk about. And the first topic we did 2 years ago was on race and ethnicity. And it was, why is this so difficult? Why do we all feel so uncomfortable to talk about this particular agenda? And we used that as a kind of backdrop, and we had a panel discussion, and we had senior leaders on it, and we sort of split out into round tables. And on the round tables, we talked about what some of the difficulties were, types of things that came up. I don't know what to call you. I know it seems weird, but it is difficult for some people. I'm scared that if I have to discipline a black person, that I'm going to be called racist, or I have to give negative feedback, that I'm going to be called racist, and everything in between. So it's tricky, but you have to start the conversation somewhere, and we have to be courageous to start the conversation.
I think we've got time for one more question. If we get a question there in the middle.
Funnily enough, work at Rare, so similarly in the diversity space. And I'm finding that, what you say is absolutely right. We need to start the conversation ourselves. But we're seeing that there's a real attrition of essentially a lot of the talent in this room who, start on graduate programs and work their way up to middle management, and then the ceiling starts to kick in. And at that level, it's sometimes very difficult to be the person starting the conversation of, well, why am I not progressing to senior leadership and management? Is it that we, at that level, need to be patient and keep pushing and persevering? Or is it really even that, change needs to come from above, and those who are really the decision makers, who are not in the main black, need to be challenged more, either by global D&I heads like yourself, or perhaps even from government. Do you think the Rooney Rule is a good idea? And someone mentioned it this morning but didn't explain it very well. The Rooney Rule is just that someone black needs to be interviewed and considered. It's not that they need to be given a job. Do we need that level of kind of proactive approach?
Look, I would definitely not advocate for anyone being patient. Life is too short. So don't be patient. You deserve it. So if you can't do it, again, this is where the network comes in. I'm sure most of you work in organizations where there is a black network or something similar, a multicultural network. Use your networks. They are the eyes and ears, and hopefully they should be able to advocate on your behalf as a collective. Go to your global head or regional head, global head of diversity and inclusion. They should be an advocate for you. If they're not, you need to keep pestering them until they do. There are lots of different avenues in which you can leverage within your organization in order to put the agenda on the agenda of the organization. Use your channels. If there's if you have surveys, make sure you voice your opinion. Just look for every possible way to get your voice heard. But as a collective, generally 1 or 2 voices isn't enough. You need to seek out other black people in your organization. The thing I would say, and this is really, really important, is that you have to advocate with skill. Don't just go in all guns blazing, or angry black woman or whatever it is. You have to be skillful in the way that you approach your organizations. Seek out other senior black people who will give you advice and guidance around the best way of doing that. But don't ever be patient. We need people like you in our organizations. So, look for ways in which you can advocate. And, I'm around. I can give you some other tips and ideas of things that you can be doing to help progress your agenda in your organizations. But the Rooney Rule, going back to the Rooney Rule, I don't know about that. I've seen organizations that have insisted on having a black person or black people on a short list. And typically what happens is they don't put the best black people on the short list. And then everyone says, they were never any good anyway. So, I am very much advocating for organizations doing their absolute best to have a candidate pool that is diverse and with quality diverse people. But I am totally against just putting someone in there just to make up numbers.
Can we get a huge round of applause for Pamela Hutchinson?